Oh, Benjamin. I don't want to say this. I've met you a couple of times. You're a cool guy. You look like a shorter, kind of squished Vince Vaughn with a deeper voice.
I can remember the first time I met the Wolfman. I was in kindergarten in Western Oregon in the elementary school library.
But your stories, man. I don't know what's happened. I honestly don't know if your writing has actually changed. It's been a while. It's been a while since I read your last book. But this is tough. This is tough. Hello, everybody. My name is Ian Kirkpattykake. I'm an author, editor, robot, and reader, and today is a book review for Benjamin Percy's Suicide Woods. It is a collection of short stories, 9 short stories, and I would say a novella at the end because it's about 1/3 just this one story. We're going to jump into what's contained in this book, my thoughts on the individual stories, on Benjamin Percy's writing style, and whether or not I recommend this book. So in starting, like I just said, there are 10 stories in all in this book. From the name Suicide Woods, you may be able to gather that it was inspired by the suicide forest in Japan. And he even says as much in there. He read an article talking about the suicide problem in Japan and was inspired to write this collection. I was under the impression that it was going to be horror, and I don't know if it is actually supposed to be a horror collection because some of them don't feel like horror. But I read a lot of disturbing stuff, so I'm not entirely sure if being a robot and a mild psychopath make me unable to see how this is horror. So story number 1 is called The Cold Boy, and it starts off with a boy falling into a frozen lake, and he comes back different. He's cold, he doesn't eat anything but ice cream and snow, he doesn't talk, he opens all of the windows in the house so that it's freezing because it's Minnesota in the winter, and then he walks out into a snowstorm at the end, and his uncle chases after him. There's not a whole lot to the story. I was kind of disappointed since this was the opening story of the book. The uncle was a taxidermist, and it being horror, I was kind of expecting for the nephew to have died. The uncle was watching the nephew while his mom was on a cruise. And so I was kind of expecting for the child to have died in the lake, but some kind of psychosis to have gone over the uncle, and the uncle taxidermies the child. I mean, that's what I was expecting, and I was like, that could have been twisted, but nothing really happens with the taxidermy. It's just kind of something that's there. There's not really anything to the story, and it doesn't really connect. The uncle just runs out into the winter at the end of the story to try to find the kid, and then is, without a jacket, and then it ends abruptly. Second story is called Suspect Zero. Yeah, it's a bunch of vignettes that I'm not really sure how they really connect. First, there's something about a train, and there's this guy that just works on a train, and then they're at a stop, and a foot kind of falls out of one of the carts, and then it switches to another thing, and then there's a house robbery. There's somebody with their hands cut off and no teeth. There is a body in a furnace room of a vacationer's home. There's a pawn shop where some lady is selling all of the stuff that looks like it was stolen. There's this big guy that's driving around in a meat truck trying to sell meat to this chick who's staying in this house by herself, and then she buys a pork loin from him, and he's in the house when she told him to stay on the porch. But all of the stories kind of abruptly end, and again, they disconnect, and I did not see the thread that went through them all. That whole short story felt disjointed. A dude at the pawn shop was like kind of came off like a loser, and a forceful loser. He knew he was a loser, and so he said something to this chick that came in to sell all of this stuff and was like, I can give you a little extra if you give me a little extra, wink wink. And she goes, no, and he goes, I wasn't asking. And so then she shoots him in the head, and I'm just, okay. Didn't really get the horror in this either. It just felt like at times, and this is something that will be reoccurring with Percy's work in this story, is it doesn't feel like anything is actually horrific, but he puts in odd details that are meant to be kind of shocking, but because there's no connection to a storyline, it just comes off as trying hard to be weird. And then in that last section where she's in the pawn shop, there's a mention of the dark web, and he did write a full novel on the dark web, and there's like 2 or 3 sentences in there that's just talking about how scary the dark web is, and I feel like it's a boomer trying to make it sound like the dark web is scarier than it is, like somebody who doesn't really get the dark web but is saying, look at me, I'm cool and chic. Because most of the time the dark web is super boring. So when you overplay and super play up that it's this really scary place, there's a lot of scary stuff on regular internet. There are pedophiles and drug dealers and all sorts of bad things on regular internet. So playing up the disturbing on the dark web, it's kind of an internet myth. The third story was called The Dummy, and it was about this kind of gender non-conforming girl who was a wrestler, didn't like the word girl, said that she played with the word they, but then the whole time the narration calls her a her. The Dummy read to me like a cross between Carrie and a Lifetime movie. So the whole thing is she is not very girlish. She is a wrestler, and she doesn't get along with the boys because the boys are like, you're kind of a dyke. When she's practicing, she asks if she can take home one of the wrestling dummies, so she takes home one of the wrestling dummies, and this is where it could have been interesting, where there's kind of a vague relationship growing between this inanimate object and herself. It's kind of rushed and not really used a whole lot. Then there's a random 2 or 3 areas throughout the book where it expresses that she abuses animals and goes out of her way to abuse animals and bugs. That has absolutely nothing to do with anything else in the story. It's just, here's a random this thing. So instead of developing this weird relationship and expressing that she's disconnected from other people, we're back to this thing where it feels like Percy inserted something disconcerting or a description that's off-putting in order to make that horrific, but it's not horrific because it doesn't make sense. It feels like it's specifically in there to be disturbing, but that makes it not disturbing. And so she's got this wrestling thing at her house, and she's kind of bonding with it to the point that she accidentally shoves its head into a nail, and then it's got a hole in its head. And then this bully that doesn't like her at school, who weighs about 180 pounds while she's 112 or 120, comes to her house and starts raping her. And then this is where she goes kind of Carrie, and she sandwiches him backwards with her mind while she's being raped, so that his back breaks, and then she thanks the dummy, and then it abruptly ends. The story was one of the shorter ones in the book, and it was switching perspectives constantly, and that's one of the things that also comes up in this book is Benjamin Percy constantly switches perspectives in very short stories in order to tell you all of this background information and all of these different characters, and it's not necessary, and it pulls you out of the story because you're now having to recalibrate to a new person when you really just want to know the story of this specific character. Like in the case of the dummy, we jumped into the head of the bully a couple of times, and we don't need to know why he hates this girl. We need to stick with this girl and her relationship with the dummy and her lack of relationship and connectivity with other people. That would have been a lot stronger than here are 3 paragraphs on animal abuse and then switching to this guy going, why is this, I don't like this dyke. I've specifically had a problem with this story because of I was starting to see anti-male mentality in Benjamin Percy actually in this, and it wouldn't have stood out as anything other than the character if there wasn't kind of an anti-male thing in a lot of the stories. In Suspect Zero, you had a woman who was a mortician, and she made a passing comment about how men don't like her. She doesn't date. She's 40 or 50 and single because no man can take her seriously when she is a mortician and a female, and screw men. And then you have the chick that went into the pawn shop and got hit on and then, attacked the guy. And then you have in this one, the chick who does not like being recognized as a female, gets raped by this guy, and at some point when she's being raped, she says, he looks like any boy. He looks like every boy, which is painting every male as a rapist. It pulled me out of the story. Number 4 was called The Heart of a Bear, and it was more like a slice of life of a bear who observed a little family out in the woods and then tried to become a human, went into the house, knocked on the door, was attacked by the wife at first, killed the wife. The husband came home for his lunch, killed the husband, sort of adopted their little infant child for a couple of pages. It cared for the child. by creating formula and going to the grocery store and eventually robbing the grocery store. And then it left a gun out and the baby killed itself, and then it wrecked the house. And it was very much like a slice of life. And I'm sure that it was supposed to be horrible because of the circumstances. But again, it was more boring to me because nothing was happening. They're like the creature, I should say, the creature slash bear, the main character, was not actively doing something. It was like stuff happening while the creature was just living its life. Number 5 was called Dial Tone. This one was another one that was set up with a bunch of vignettes, and it centered around a telemarketer. Again, this one read disjointed to me for the sake of being strange, with more random descriptions, random actions in there, and just being jumpy for the point of trying to make you confused, but so that confusion and the weird descriptions make you uneasy. It did not connect to me. Maybe my mind is too simple and I just can't see it, but more disconcerting to me was it read like the character was just crazy for the sake of crazy is scary because it's unpredictable. There wasn't like a rationale or a rhyme or reason or a logic, and even behind an absolutely insane person, there should be a method to the madness. So if we look at Albert Fish, who was by all psychological, what's the word that I want? Evaluations, he was insane. His sons thought he was insane. He climbed up to a tree at some point. I think it was he climbed up to a tree at some point and was screaming about how he was Jesus Christ. He was so insane. He was obsessed, compulsively writing obscene letters to strangers who put their addresses in the newspaper. And he pricked himself constantly with little pins that he put into his scrotum. And by prick, I mean he took little needles and he shoved them into his scrotum so far that they got lodged. And I think it was that they did an x-ray on his hips / pelvis and found that he had 27 needles embedded in his lower half that could not be removed. And why did he do this? Why would somebody do this to themselves? He believed that he deserved to be punished. And so it might not make actual sense if you look at the actions on their own, but if you get into the head of the crazy person, there is always a reason behind what they are doing, and it makes logical sense to them. And so when I looked at this character in Dial Tone, getting back to the actual book here, the character didn't come off to me like he had a rhyme or a reason, and it could have easily been inserted because the connective tissue was mostly there, but it was not actually connected. And so instead he read sporadic, he read disjointed, and like I've said this a bunch of times now, the disjointed was meant, it felt like the disjointed was meant to make you uncomfortable, and that was supposed to be the horror because you didn't know what was coming. And instead that reads cheap, and that reads like using insanity or mental illness in a cheap way just to scare people. The 6th story was called Mudman, and the story felt like it relied specifically on body horror. The main character was a man. He was in his garden. He smashed his finger with like the little rake thing he was using, and his fingernail pops off, and there's a little description of his fingernail bleeding and turning black and blah blah blah. And he tosses the fingernail into the garden, and that fingernail kind of gets covered in dirt and starts forming into a man, and over time it becomes kind of a shadow of him that starts doing all of the chores at the house and helping take care of the house and helping his wife and playing with his child. And over time he feels replaced, or he becomes replaced, and he gets home from work one day and his wife and his child are out in the backyard playing with the Mudman, and his sheets are all dirty, and that's kind of where it ends. It ends with him smacking the counter a lot while looking out the window at the Mudman with his family. And that's the end. So again, we don't have an ending here. The character doesn't take action, and one of the other things that we'll see continually with Percy is that he doesn't end his stories. As stuff is starting to escalate or stuff is getting to the point where a character has to make a decision, he ends it. And so that's something that really bothered me with almost all of his stories, if not all of his stories. Number 7 was another bunch of vignettes. It was called The Right of Possessions, and it was a bunch of different stories about houses that were either being repossessed or people. That's pretty much it. Houses that were being repossessed in different ways. There was also a development community that was abandoned by the builders, and so that was repossessed by the wilderness. It starts out with the perspective of a female cop who, again, is butch, looks like a man when she is approached. When people look at her, they think she's a man because she's just manly. And she goes to a house complaining about how, in the 3 years she's been doing this, everybody is a victim of their own circumstances. It's a bunch of people that are, buying dogs when the money that went toward the dog could have been used to pay for your bill, or she opens the door and there's a big plasma screen TV, and so they didn't pay their rent because they bought a TV instead. And so she's just ranting about all of these terrible people do this to themselves so she doesn't feel bad. And the first person she opens the door to is this old man who has almost nothing, who's a vet, and who just says, okay, I'm gonna go. And then he says, just so you know, sometimes I die, and I'm letting you know that because I feel like it's coming on soon. And my heart just stops for a couple of moments and then it starts back up again. And she asks, what's it feel like to die? And he tells her, and that's where that vignette ends. So again, we're seeing right where it gets interesting, and then it cuts it off. And then it goes to another vignette, and another, and another. And there's one that has two kids, a brother and a sister, that break into a house, or sneak into a house in a rich neighborhood during the day when the owners of the house are gone. And, they use the facilities, and they use the showers, and they eat, and blah, blah, blah. And again, we have the compulsive gender bending here, where the sister goes and puts on the suits, and the boy puts on the cocktail dresses for really no apparent reason. It's like a sentence. And we get to a part where the cop comes back to a different person. There's one where the cop shows up and they repossess the television to pay for something. There's one where the cop shows up and it's this old lady in her house all by herself. Her husband died, her son died. She's super helpful at church, but nobody at church knows what's going on in her life. And then she ends up shooting herself. And then at the very end, we're back in the cop's perspective as she's standing outside the door. Like, we do the woman shoots herself, then we go to the abandoned housing development, and then we come back to the lady cop who's standing outside, and she's scared to go to the next, or reluctant to go to the next house because of all of this bad stuff that happened. And so this feels disjointed. It feels like it's in the wrong order. And it also feels like it should have been following the journey of the cop, where she goes from this is so stupid, all of these people do this to themselves, to then seeing the more serious sides of things. But it starts with her complaining, and then she sees somebody serious, and then it's serious the whole way through. So you get her frustration, but you never see her actually facing the situations she's complaining about. Number 8 was called The Balloon, and it is a short story that became the beginning of his Lewis and Clark zombie novel, The Deadlands. It starts by introducing a dangerous disease. The symptoms cause the main character's parents to die while she's taking care of them. Though she cannot get the disease, she does spread it, and then it's all over the place, and she's got balloons tied to her bed so that she can imagine herself flying off. And she's a fantasy writer and writes about her sword and being a knight. The other main character in this is a cop who wants to be the hero but is also afraid of everything and imagines himself as Rapunzel, being in a tower. I'm sure you're seeing the compulsion right now. Again, it feels a lot more like a slice of life because nobody in this story of there's this disease and this bad stuff is happening is actually taking action or moving along. They're just kind of going through the motions of living through every day, and stuff is happening to them or happening around them, but they're hardly reacting, and they're not going out to accomplish something. Like, one of the things that comes through in each of these stories is that there is not a goal, there is not an action, there is not a desire. They are just doing their things. And so then me as the reader, as I'm watching these characters, I don't have anything to go, okay, so when has this character won? When has this character achieved what they want? There is none, because most of these characters, if not all of these characters, I would say most of these characters, are just going through the motions of life. Number 9 is the title story, Suicide Woods, and it is about a group of people who are all suicidal, and they're all part of this kind of group to help them be not suicidal. And it's in the way that they have a kind of a sensei that was suicidal who is trying to knock them out of being suicidal. And eventually, one of the exercises for this group is they all are buried alive in individual coffins for the night with a little bit of air. And the new girl that joined the group died, while the rest of them are like, oh, I've never had more of an appreciation for life in my life because of this. And so there's that. And then the final story in this is the novella that takes about a third of the book, called Uncharted, or The Uncharted. And it is about a group of YouTubers that are hired to go to an obscure location in Alaska because some geomappers disappeared while trying to get pictures of the area, and then they get stranded on this island with weird stuff happening, a weird tree that kind of eats people, and hallucinations. And again, we run into this issue where Percy can't stick with his character motivations or his character descriptions that he started with. So the female character in this talks about how she likes to live her life safely. She is an office worker. And the main male character in this is a daredevil who feels like he was supposed to die when he got in an accident with his family, and everyone in his family died but him. And so the girl's main issue is that she does not trust anybody, and she has decided never to trust anybody. And the boy's main issue is that he feels guilty because he didn't die, and so he feels like he's still alive to be doing something that's more important than Daredevil videos. At the beginning of the book, at the beginning of the story, he even says, I'm done with this, I want to do something else, and that's why he takes on the job of going to find the lost people in Alaska. The main character conflict that would cause them to have their character arc, their character growth, would force the girl to trust somebody because her issue is already that she does not trust people. And that the boy would have his chance to risk his life to save somebody else, or or to use his knowledge of being a daredevil and how many times he has avoided death to save somebody else's life. So what would have really, really worked for me for this story, what would have made sense to me as the climax, where if the guy and the girl got into a situation where they could have died, they should have died, and he said, look, I've been through this before, you need to trust me on this, and she can't trust him, and she is eventually forced to trust him, and he has her life in his hands. Now, this could be another body that he feels guilty for if he fails. And so having them push, and then she trusts him, they get out alive, and he feels some level of relief or repentance or freedom because he was able to use his ability to survive or his luck to survive to help somebody else. That would have been a powerful moment, but instead you have her being sucked into a hallucination caused by this island where she says, well, I don't trust anybody anyway, so I don't trust what I'm seeing with my own eyes, and she breaks out of it without any problem whatsoever. And then after that point, she just becomes the biggest bossy bitch, while the guy who was outlandish and a daredevil suddenly becomes a pansy, and he is moaning and he is just depressed and he doesn't have any sense of survival anymore, while she's yelling at him and telling him, no, this is what we're gonna do now, even though she's the office worker. So their personalities just completely switched. She was unprepared to be in the wilderness, but suddenly, because she doesn't trust this vision, and she never trusted anything anyway, she's got the survival and he's lost the survival. It really came to my attention in this story that I felt like Percy had it stuck in him. We all receive the feedback at some point that details, or the comment at some point, that details are the thing that bring out the character. Details are important. But you don't need to put details on every little thing. Like if you walk into a room and there's a couch and a chair and a big window, you don't need to say, the red couch that was super plush and it was Baroque style, and like give all of the little tiny details of that couch, unless that couch is important. The important thing about details is to grab the things that create the character. You don't have to describe everything in minor detail. And that includes character backgrounds. If this character is only going to be mentioned once in this one paragraph, we don't need to know all of their background or half of their life story just to have their name mentioned once and then move on and never hear about them again. Also, there's this really, really most bizarre statement at the end of the book that goes, look at the moon, people say, turning their faces upward. No one ever says that about the sun because it's our standard, our normal, our boring. Life is like sunlight, but dying is like moonlight. Maybe that explains her attraction to Josh. So, the moon is beautiful because nobody ever says... The moon is beautiful because people say, look at the moon. But the sun is normal and ugly because nobody ever says, look at the sun. That is the most bizarre statement, an attempt... It feels like an attempt to be deep that's not really meaningful. Nobody says, look at the sun because you burn your eyes and you can go blind. It's not because the sun isn't beautiful. The sun is an explosion and kind of has a way different effect on your eyeballs than the moon. Uncharted had a lazy ending and a lazy explanation where the one character was trying to theorize, oh, that's right, so there was this tree that was eating people and causing visions, and the visions were trying to take off some of the main characters to go and just sit under the tree and die for the rest of their life, and there was no explanation for anything that was going on. There were like werewolves on that island changed to a tree, and flocks of geese that were in cages, and nothing on that island was ever explained. And when one character tried to figure out what was going on, the main female character just said, forget about it, we don't need any kind of explanation. And the story just ends with some myths are yet to be discovered. So that really just felt like a lazy way of trying to cut it off. No explanation, no idea who the people wearing the bone masks were running around the island, no idea what was going on, no idea why some of the trees had faces in them. It was just a bunch of weird things thrown together in order to maybe make you uncomfortable by virtue of them being weird and also there being death. But because there was no lore, and you don't have to connect everything, you don't have to explain everything in horror, but you have, to me, in my opinion, you have to connect and be telling a story as opposed to just throwing out random things. Otherwise, a story can just continue to throw out horrific things that are completely unconnected, completely nonsensical, but they're horrible. I'm sorry, that makes it cheap. So one more thing on this Uncharted story, and I'm going to do my roundup on Percy. Because it's constantly changing perspectives, the final perspective that it goes into is the female main characters. The male main character at the ending of the story is going into a psychosis caused by the trees, where one of his friends that died is telling him, hey, why don't you said you were done with this whole mess, why don't you just come and sit under the tree? I know a great tree that we could just relax under. And so that's the tree that is going to eat him and basically suck out his life. And he's stuck in this psychosis talking to his friend. Percy kind of avoids having continuous dialogue or having characters interact for long periods of time, and I feel like it's because he doesn't necessarily feel comfortable having them interact. That's just how it came off to me. I don't know if it's true, but he avoids it. And so you've got this character, again, in this tense moment, in this tense climactic moment where he's making the choice to go to his certain death. We know he's going to a certain death, and instead of working out that scene with the female character saving his life, because that would have been a big deal, it cuts to the next perspective, and it starts, that section breaks out from his psychosis to her perspective to say, in the end, she had to hit him with an oar. So it completely skips the actual interaction and just summarizes it so they don't have to have that actual interaction. And this happened a lot, where the story either cut off when a decision had to be made, when characters had to interact to make a change. And this is why so many of the stories did not have endings, because it would have forced the characters to do something. So in looking at Benjamin Percy's writing in this book specifically, what stands out to me is when I'm reading these shorts is that character development seems to be missing. Horror goes for the weird or the bizarre factor and the description factor, without ever actually developing in a logical way and to make sense in even an irrational way. It's my opinion that if you're going to do psychological horror, character is beyond important. Instead, Percy spends most of his time writing strange or dark settings or weird metaphors that are supposed to be horrifying by virtue of existing, like, I mean, this isn't really a metaphor, but there's a part in there with the telemarketer guy that his eye is bleeding and somebody says, hey, your eye is bleeding, what's wrong with that? And he's like, oh, and he's touching it and he's thinking about it, and then it just goes into, I want to take it out of my eye and put it in my mouth and chew it. And that's the only time that pops up. Like, we have no other forms showing the psychosis. It's just like, here's this random thing out of nowhere that should make you uncomfortable because it's strange out of nowhere. And because of that, it seems like the weird is all he is actually able to have for the spooky. Another area that I'm sure affects my enjoyment of Percy's work is that he spends much more time on the description or trying to insert spooky vibes than speech or character interactions. If you've heard me talk about Bret Easton Ellis, then you know that I love character dialogue, I love character interaction, and I love deep characters. And if you've read my work, like Dead and Drive, you'll know that my characters interact a lot. Another criticism I have, if you can call it that, is that his stories sort of meander. Rather than something happening and characters taking action against it or going to do something. Things just happen to them while the characters go through their regular life. Think back to the Mudman, where the Mudman is formed and then starts taking over his life. The character just sort of lets the Mudman come into his life, do things, and then at the end, when he sees the Mudman with his wife, and you get this sense that he's getting jealous, that he thinks his wife is cheating on him with the Mudman, he just slams his hand into the counter, and there is no interaction. Nothing happens. The story cuts off and ends there. This made the stories flat for me, the characters plainer, and I didn't really care for any of it. Then there was finally a compulsion to mess with gender stereotypes every single time. Not even gender stereotypes, but just gender roles. And usually I wouldn't care if it's just here and there and whatever. But it was like every single time there was a female and a male, he had to put the female into the position of power, and he had to demean the male characters or disempower the male characters, and he had to make many of the female characters mannish or appear male or hate being female. And like, there was no point for the brother and sister to be gender swapping their clothing in just that one sentence. And so at this point it felt compulsive that he needed to change genders or just insert something like that into his stories, and that was distracting for me. You know, once or twice is a story choice. In every single story, it becomes a compulsive pattern. And obviously that doesn't bother other people, but it did bother me. At the end of the day, I would not recommend this book. Sorry. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Have you read any of Benjamin Percy's works? Have you read this? Have you read any of these short stories? What do you think about some of the things that I have said as criticisms or critiques? Are they things that you like? Are they things that you enjoy? Let me know all that and more down in the comments down below. If you have any books that you would like me to read and review or critique in some way, drop me your suggestions. And until next time, I'll see you in the next video. Don't die. Dear Madam Astra, that's me. We regret to inform you that on August 1st, your employer, Agatha Jane Benedict, owner of the Benedict estate, peacefully passed away in her sleep. Oh, that's so sad. Wait. Let me try that again. Oh my goodness. That's so sad. Yeah, I think I'm ready. With millions of dollars on the line and the opportunity for your every need to be taken care of for life, tell me, is there anything more valuable than that? I didn't think so. Dead End Drive is a dark comedy novel that makes 3 promises. 1, an illustrious estate in Louisiana. 2, an opulent dinner affair for all in attendance. And 3, and most importantly of all, lots and lots of competitive murder. So if you're looking for a cozy book to settle in with for the spooky season, I've only got one question for you. Will I see you at the whale reading?